Our next plenary speaker is none other than Dr. Patriann Smith. Dr. Smith was born and raised in St. Lucia. She is associate professor at the University of South Florida, and her research considers how literacy teaching, research assessment, and policy are influenced by the intersection of race, language, and immigration. She draws from the Black Englishes of Afro-Caribbean immigrants, other Black immigrants in the United States, for example, African, and Black American students, for example, African American, to propose solutions that advance racial and linguistic justice in literacy. She also explores the Englishes of Black populations in their English-speaking Caribbean locales to make recommendations for advancing literacy teaching across local, national, and international boundaries. Dr. Smith has proposed solutions such as a Transraciolinguistic approach and the framework for Black immigrant literacies to clarify how literacy can be re-envisioned and taught to all students in classrooms. She currently serves as co-PI of the USAID-funded $3.6 million RISE Caribbean grant designed to establish a research center that enhances research-based decision-making in the Caribbean. Dr. Smith's research is published in multiple journals. She is co-author of the recently released book, Affirming Black Students' Lives and Literacies, Bearing Witness, published by Teachers College Press. Dr. Patriann, we welcome you.
Thank you, Dr. Brian, for the lovely introduction. It's great to be here. I am trying to get my slides organized. Can you just let me know if you are seeing my slides or if they are showing up in a way that's probably not as great as I would like?
We can see your slides perfectly.
No notes are showing up.
No notes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Brian. It's wonderful to be here. And good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Brian said, my name is Patriann Smith. I am associate professor here at the University of South Florida in Tampa, warm, sunny, very, very sunny. And it's been a great summer so far. And I'm just so happy to be in community with you all and to share a little bit about disentanglements of racialized Englishes and peoples across Black and white worlds. So without further ado, I will dive in. But before I do that, I'd like to just ask for us to place in the chat, those of you who are from different places across the globe, can you just put in the chat where you're from so I can have a sense of who and all is in our global community here? Just a city, a state, a country. Just drop that in the chat. So I'll give us just a few seconds. I see Fort Lauderdale, Egypt, New Jersey. Oh, there are a couple of Egypt locations here. Anybody from the Caribbean? I see quite a few states showing up. Senegal, Louisiana. All right, anyone with Caribbean heritage? Of course, as you probably know, some of you, that I am from the island of St. Lucia. I think Dr. Brian mentioned as well. So it's great to see this representation. I'm just really happy to see us all as global citizens engaging together. And I like to think of myself as a global citizen. So when I come into a community like this, I always like to know who is represented. So thanks everyone for sharing that as we get started here. And before I move forward, of course, I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which USF stands and the Calusa people, the Seminole tribe, the indigenous people, the original people who were here before we came. And so, as I mentioned a while ago, Caribbean heritage, of course, St. Lucia was my home. It still is my home, sort of, and I go back and forth between homes, I like to call it. And just, you know, feeling great that I can talk through some of these tensions and these complicated sorts of notions around mobility and racialization and language with you this afternoon. When I was asked to prepare this, this plenary in relation to our theme, inspiring, empowering, and advancing the global language teaching community, one of the first words that came to my mind was entanglements. Now, I know that when some of you hear entanglements, the first thing that comes to mind is Jada Pinkett or August Alsina or Will Smith. But no, I don't plan to dwell on Jada or, or August or Will this afternoon. I will pass on that. What I do plan to do this afternoon, though, is to talk a little bit about the notion of entanglements, because when I first embarked on what I think of as my life's work, and no, I'm not that old because I just started in 2013, I haven't lived that long. So I was thinking a lot about the quantum world, and it was at the core of my thinking. I drew a little bit from Baccarat Niculescu's work and thought a little bit about transdisciplinarity, and proposed then that the laws of quantum physics be applied to multiculturalism to bring about what Niculescu calls a new kind of education that focuses equally on the body and on the emotions and the and on the sensitivity. And so with that starting off, thinking of quantum entanglement, and I know some of you are probably Googling already because you're very savvy, internet savvy. Thinking of quantum entanglement suggests that entanglement occurs when a pair of particles, such as photons, interact physically. In quantum physics, we see entangled particles remaining very connected when these particles are separated, even though there is distance between them. And so they remain connected and they are still affected by what happens to the other particle because they have this entanglement. It is said that Albert Einstein found this idea so fascinating that he referred to it as spooky action at a distance. And so here you can just see a visualization of that. Two photons, they're very separate, but they're entangled. So what happens to one happens to the other one as well, or it's at least affected by it, right? This notion of entanglement and being entangled. So the rules of quantum physics also state that any unobserved photon can exist in all possible states simultaneously, but that when we measure it or observe it, that is when we get just one state. We think about this and we think about the notion of possibility, right? And all of the possibilities that exist when it comes to entanglements around language, how we teach language, how we engage students, teachers with language. And so we think about all the possibilities that do exist and how limited they can become when we do put our finger on them or measure them or use them or teach them in a classroom. And so thinking of this idea, all these possibilities, and how they become something that is instantiated or that is reduced or that is limited, led me to look back at my work with a transracial-linguistic approach and to sort of look at some of these entanglements that I had already even begun implicitly thinking about in relation to racialized people. So for example, if you look here in the diagram on the left in that red circle, represented there would be the racialized student populations in the classroom. And when I was thinking about a transracial linguistic approach, one of the ways in which I was thinking about entanglements, even though not even knowing, it's that the individuals were coming up with these meta-linguistic, meta-cultural, and meta-racial understandings that they were developing in relation to the language that they were using. So the entanglements that they had between themselves, their bodies, and the Englishes that they were using, that was actually instantiating this whole idea of different types of understanding that they then were using to engage with dominant populations in different kinds of ways. And so I kept thinking as I was preparing for this talk about how entanglements are embedded very deeply in what we do as language professionals, language teachers. They're also very much embedded in who we are with our personal and professional communities, and even in our global communities as well. For the purpose of this talk, entanglement also came to mind because of my encounters with the term entanglements of Englishes by linguist and distinguished professor emeritus Alistair Pennycook in publications such as his keynote speech that he did on entanglements of Englishes. He's also presented work about translingual entanglements of Englishes that really came to inform how I was thinking about racialized notions of entanglements and the relations to Englishes. And so the overview of this presentation, basically, what I would like to do is I would like to talk through what I am calling 3 arguments that come out of my work with Black immigrants and Black Caribbean nationals who are English speaking, and just talking through some of these key arguments here that I'm calling premises that are based on this notion of entanglements. And so the first one that I would focus on, it states that entanglements emerge in unique ways between Englishes and racialized migrants in the United States, and I'm calling the white world for the purpose of this presentation in quotes. Entanglements also occur in unique but similar ways between Englishes and racialized English-speaking Caribbean nationals. And then the third one, entanglements are constantly being redefined in dynamic spaces between Englishes and the racialized bodies that use them based on institutional and local norms within and across global contexts. So as a scholar who centralizes intersectionality in my research, as proposed by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and as someone who centralizes race in literacy based on calls by Professor Alec Willis, entanglements for me really then, when I think of languaging, necessarily invokes a connection to racialization and mobility. Hence the title of my talk, Disentanglements of Racialized Englishes and Peoples Across These Worlds. So today, let's just talk through some of these arguments that I'm proposing, and I'd love to get your take on what you're thinking about these as I go through them. So feel free to drop your comments in the chat and to engage with me through this process. Before I move forward, it's probably helpful to clarify what I mean by racialized entanglements of Englishes. And when I think of racialized entanglements of Englishes, again, I go back to Pennycook's work on the notion of entanglements of Englishes, the idea that the natural world is part of us and we are part of it. So Englishes, therefore, are part of us and we are part of them. Englishes will always be part of the problem, says Alistair Pennycook, because we are naturally entangled with the Englishes that we use. So when I think then of racialized entanglements of Englishes, I think of the racialized body impacting the Englishes as much as Englishes impact the racialized body. Englishes, therefore, and the racialized body becoming one. And I make the argument that we cannot possibly observe or teach language as a construct that is out there, isolated from the racialized body. And every time we observe or measure how language relates to the racialized body, even so, we are only encountering just one state of the many possibilities of entanglements that can potentially exist. And so more broadly speaking, then, we want to think about imagining spaces, right, excuse me, that are constantly defined and redefined by institutional and societal norms, where Englishes and racialized bodies are constantly being juxtaposed and interacting with each other. And the notion that we can't possibly observe or teach language as a construct that is so removed from the body. What does that actually mean for what we do in our enterprise, in the linguistic enterprise? If we think in this way, racialized entanglements of Englishes, the entangled particles of racialized bodies and Englishes, they remain connected so that the actions that we perform on Englishes affect us, and then the actions that are performed on us affect the Englishes that we use, right? Even when there may be distance between them. And so let's go to premise 1. And I'm just going to stop for a moment here and talk through what this actually means. Entanglements emerge in unique ways between the Englishes and the racialized migrants that come to the United States. So here, if you just permit me to just read this quote to you from one of my recently published studies with Professor Joel Warrican, you will notice here that one of the participants is talking as a Black male who is Bahamian and who has migrated to the United States. And he says, in terms of how others treat me in classes as a Black male, if I was not Bahamian, I would be just a Black male. I feel as if me speaking the way I speak means I have more recognition, or I'm able to strike up more conversations and people are more interested in asking me, oh, where are you from? Or why do you speak like that? Instead of me talking like an African American, sometimes intentionally I put on my Bahamian accent to, like, if I'm suiting, right, calling out a lady or something like that, because I guess it gives me a certain pizzazz when I speak my Caribbean accent. So sometimes I intentionally just talk like a Bahamian. I think that's more attractive. And I guess the majority of the Bahamian guys, they would say the same thing. When I do that, I'm like a special little apple with a Bahamian flag on it. When people interact with me or they walk past me, instead of seeing a regular apple, they see little blue, black, and gold, something on the apple, and they would like to know, how come the apple look like that? So if you allow me to just backtrack here for a little moment, you will notice that this student participant is talking about the way that he becomes many different instantiations of himself through these Englishes. The racialized bodies interacting with the same English, with the same language, English, but the interaction between the body and Englishes is redefined based on the privilege that is given by either the global national state norms that he's operating with, the people that are actually leveraging these norms, or how he dictates he is going to leverage these norms against himself. And so you have this dynamic taking place with this Black Caribbean immigrant student. And here he continues again, saying when it comes to relating to African-American males and African males in the US, I use my accent with them because the guys who are from Nigeria, they speak with their African accent 100% of the time. So when they're on the court, when we're on the court, they say, hey, and all of that stuff, and all African stuff that I don't understand. And I feel more comfortable with my accent interacting with them. But the African-American guys, for African-Americans, I speak more American with them than I would speak with the Africans. I think the Africans, I think it's because they're not exposed to language differences. Some of them only have been in America, and that, I think he's talking about African Americans here, and that goes for the guy whose parents are African American as well. The Africans, on the other hand, they may be African American, but many of them live in a family where their parents speak African slang, so they still can understand my accent well. Those are the guys on this side, though, right? He is saying they're just around the African American sound, so they wouldn't understand me. When it comes to girls, I change my conversation so that people can understand what I'm saying most of the time. But like in my parties or social events, my accent is there because I'm excited, I do an emotion. And then, so I guess girls, they then react a certain way. They look back, and when we as Bahamian guys open our mouth, they look back and say, who's that? Because it sounds different to what they normally hear. When I'm in constant conversation with them, I switch it on and off. And so you see that relationship between the Englishes and the body that he is navigating through those metacultural, metalinguistic, metaracial understandings that he is leveraging. The entanglements are actually creating this opportunity for him to decide how he will work in certain ways to navigate these linguistic differences as an immigrant. If we move on to premise 2, we see that entanglements occur in unique but similar ways between Englishes and racialized English-speaking Caribbean nationals. And I call this the Black world only because the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, where these folks came from, it's predominantly Black. And so here we can see, if I move forward with this slide, Black Caribbean nationals in the English-speaking Caribbean, their Englishes are entangled in specific ways based on how they are racialized given the institutional norms that are present, right? So the racialized body interacts with the same language, which is English, but different, what we often call different dialects of English in specific spaces, right? Interaction between the body and English is redefined based on privilege that local institutional norms provide. And so if we go here to an example from one of the participants, and this is out of a piece that's coming out soon in with a book with Oxford University Press, we can see here that the Barbadian educator who is currently in the Caribbean is talking about her experiences with the language system and with teaching English and English language arts. She says, in my mind, Caribbean people from language and everything, they are so very schizophrenic about identity. And when I heard her say this, I thought about Dr. Shondell Nero, who I saw with us earlier this morning. And I kept thinking how I encountered the term attitudinal schizophrenia in her work. But here we have the participants saying, I think so. They don't understand whether they're fish or fowl. And so, no, I seriously think that this is the way they are. And it comes down to the language as well. So on some level, we want to have our own language and so on, because deep down, it's a part of who we are. But because at some level, we keep hearing the voice in our head that says it's not good enough. And we want to aspire towards what other people tell us is good. So we want to go there too. We're kind of torn between that voices in our head and what is in our heart. Total schizophrenia, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to these things. And I don't know what the solution is, because it is digging into the psyche of a people. And so if I just backtrack here, you can see sort of that tension between the Englishes and the body. You can see the talking about the heart that's actually taking place here. And a lot of the times with the participants that I've worked with, we hear this kind of tension that takes place as they interact with the Englishes that they're working on. And so what I've come to say is that entanglements are constantly being redefined in dynamic spaces between Englishes and racialized bodies based on how institutional and local norms are positioning individuals within and across global contexts. I'm also proposing that the basis for entanglements between Englishes and racialized people move beyond static notions of how Englishes are racialized based on race to thinking about the spaces within which Englishes and racialized bodies encounter each other. What are those spaces and how do they encounter each other? And a transraciolinguistic approach really is just a first step in that kind of direction, right? In removing the focus from Englishes or the body to the spaces within which the body and Englishes engage in these numerous possibilities of entanglements. And then number two, I'm saying that there is a need for us to further examine how unequal Englishes evolve as the racialized body interacts with what we call the same language, but what are different dialects. Right. And so thinking about how the racialized body becomes engaged and entangled with these different kinds of Englishes based on power structures is something that can be useful for the field. And so the question becomes, how and why is it necessary to engage in a disentangling of racialized Englishes and peoples across Black and white worlds? I mean, is it even necessary to disentangle racialized Englishes and peoples? I'm going to ask that question to our population, just give you a chance to respond. So let me just give you a moment to let me know what you think. Should we disentangle racialized Englishes and peoples? Just put a yes in the chat if you agree that we should, or no if you think that we should not. All right, we have yes from Andy and Jennifer, a couple of yeses coming through. I like Christina's response because I would want to hear from her shortly about the yes, no. I like the both and Christina. This is sort of really down my alley. I see a couple of emphatic yeses. I love the energy. Oh, Andy says it depends. Well, we have some more complications there. So Andy will definitely be someone that we need to hear from as well. And Cornisha says yes. So I'm going to talk through what I prepared, and then I'm gonna sort of say to you guys, what do you think now? Can we try that? Let's try that. So if I move here to the next slide, you can see that, let me just backtrack a bit. I think I skipped something. So when we think about the notion of disentangling, right, it makes me think of Ofelia Garcia's recent piece with quite a group of scholars. I think Nelson Flores was also a co-author on that piece. So there were quite a number of individuals on there. Professor Ofelia Garcia and colleagues talked about rejecting abyssal thinking in the linguistic repertoires of racialized bilingual students and multilingual students. We also have had recently the annual review of applied linguistics, talking through some of this notions around racialization and how this affects educational enterprise with language. And also Professor Uju Anya, folks like Dr. Tasha Austin, who I just saw in the chat. Hi, Tasha. And so just thinking about some of these anti-Black racism in language education efforts that are actually taking place, and the degree to which disentanglement, right, is actually part of those efforts. I think that these scholars that I've just named and many others increasingly emphasize the need for disentangling racialized languages and peoples, not just Englishes. But as Professor Pennycook says, to disentangle does not mean to unentangle. Right. And so that's where it becomes a little complicated. How does one take away the standardized Englishes that are associated with privilege from one's personhood in the Caribbean? Right? How does one extract English from the sense of self to make room for other languages or other dialects that seem to have lesser status? How does one do that? Becomes a question. How does one extricate certain Englishes from the self to make room for what we think are other varieties of English that need to have that place in the personhood of the child? The answer is simple. I argue one does not do any of those things, because to do that would be to destroy the self, which is already made up of these linguistic repertoires that the self has developed throughout whether it's childhood or its adulthood, right? And so instead, I argue, based on Alistair Pennycook's work, that the focus must be to disentangle, not unentangle, but disentangle. That is to rethink, to reimagine, to restructure the quantum entanglements that already exist between racialized peoples and the languaging that they already possess. So now that I've said this, I'm going to go back to the chat and I'm going to just get a sense of what are people thinking about that response. All I want to see is a makes sense. I don't think so. I need some more clarification. Just give me a little response. I like interaction. Makes sense could be one response. I don't think so could be another one, or need more clarity here. So just really trying to get a sense of what you're thinking as I go through to this next slide. Feel free to put that in the chat, folks. Of course, there is also an option to sit in silence. So, so if I move forward a little bit and think about racialized entanglements of Englishes and people, and we return to the transraciolinguistic approach, we think for a moment that these racialized individuals who will on the left here in that red circle, right? If we think about how they are operating with Englishes, I could potentially represent it with an arrow, a multi-directional arrow that demonstrates how a person, a racialized body, right, is entangled with the Englishes on the right, right? And whatever is happening to the Englishes is happening to the racialized body, And whatever is happening to the racialized body is happening to the Englishes, right? This notion of entanglements. At the very top, we have the photons, right? And I showed you those earlier. And now I'm arguing that there is also this possibility of thinking about this connection, this entanglement at this level where the body is engaged with languaging and with languages in this particular kind of way that prevents the extricating of one from the other, and that necessitates an attention to how the two are operating in this entanglement. And so I see here I have quite a lot of folks in the chat responding. I love the responses. I'll get back to them in a bit. I've just been given my little notice. I'll move forward to wrap things up shortly here. And then we'll get back, of course, to the Q&A, Dr. Brian, if that's okay. And we'll talk through some of these tensions that we're seeing there in the chat. So what can you do is the question, because all of this is great theorizing, and I'm very, fascinated by a lot of the ideas I heard this morning. And I often think, what can we do with some of this stuff, right? And so I thought, thinking about this entanglement, how can we disentangle through standards? I've presented some of that in the reading teacher, and I thought I would just share this example with you. I'm not going to go into detail because I can just send this to you and we can talk about it off this session. We can disentangle through storylines, again, a transracial-linguistic approach, another tangible way for those of you who are educators working with youth who are racialized and who are immigrants and who really need some supports. There is also this idea that we can disentangle for enhancing relations among racialized and dominant peers, really getting that solidarity into play. This can be done through lesson plans and through lesson plans and through reorganizing the entire lesson structure by a transracial linguistic approach. Number 4, I have Disentangling for Enhancing Relations Among Racialized Groups. This is our recent book. We're very excited about this book. Professor Arlette Willis, Professor Dr. Gwen McMillan, and myself here talking through some of these national and also international tensions around how racialization occurs with languaging and with literacies in the classroom. And then number 5, Disentangling for Broad Educational Change. One of the pieces that Alistair Pennycook has talked about is just this notion of critical activism. We see it with Ophelia Garcia. We see it with the Literacy Futurisms Collective in the Making. Amelie Lemieux, I'm not sure if she's here. Manka Vargas, Dr. Jonathan Rosen, Nelson Flores, Cameron Khan, Alice Lee. I'm sure I'm leaving out folks, but these are some of the critical activism folks who I believe are really positioned to move the field forward. Dr. Nero, Dr. Rahat Zaidi, Dr. Keisha Bryan, our very own, Awad Ibrahim, Tasha Austin, who is here, Dr. Benji Chang, who unfortunately has just recently passed. I'm still just in shock. We have Smalls, I can't remember her first name, but she's informed a lot of my thinking. Vijay Ramjatan, Alison Scarrett, Lakia Omagud. So quite a lot of our scholars, and I'm pretty sure I've not mentioned them all here, doing this critical activism work that I think is much needed in the current moment to move things forward. But I think I have extended my stay with the presentation. Dr. Brian, you've been so graceful. Thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity to share. And I'll just pass it back over to you, Dr. Brian, if I can maybe stop sharing my screen, or what would you like me to do?
Sure. You can leave it up there for
a little while. Okay, good.
For a little bit. Yes, we have about 5 more minutes. I just want to thank you for such a scientific and engaging talk about disentangling racialized Englishes across Black and white worlds. So we'll open it up for any questions that might be had. It's 11:36. We have a few more minutes. Any questions or comments in the chat, or did someone want to speak?
There is so much here, and I know I wanted to hear about someone who said yes and no. It was yes. Christina. Mm-hmm. Oh, Rashida is also has her hand up. So maybe we
Rashida,
go.
Christina, yes.
Yeah, my question one, the presentation was awesome. Thank you so much for that explanation of disentanglement. But then I want to know what brought you to this work? Like, what was your inspiration? What brought you to it?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that, Rashida, and I'm so glad that you asked, but I didn't want to spend the whole presentation on that because it's so much of me grappling with spirituality and becoming, right, someone who wants to embody the work that I'm doing. Because, it's not easy to write about this stuff, right? But it's a lot, it's sort of a life's work. And so every time I am coming to it, I keep asking myself, what am I missing, in terms of me becoming a better person? And I think that piece of embodying the work that I'm doing and becoming the person that lives with it and sits with it and doesn't just write about it and it's out there and I'm here. Part of that is what led me to this. I also think it's the hope piece, the whole idea that there is so much going on in the world and so many of our children are affected by what is happening with racialization and how language is either a vehicle for giving hope or for dismantling the child in classrooms. And I kept thinking, how do we bring the soul in? And that has been something that I've grappled with since 2013 about the soul and connecting the soul to the work in very concrete ways. And I think this is just another step in that direction. A chapter that I wrote recently, I talk a lot about what does it mean to do soul in literacy, right? And the soul needs to be present. And I like to think of wanting to be in the academy with my soul and not without it. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Dr. Murray.
Hi, Dr. Smith. Fascinating presentation. I have a question. I know in St. Lucia, there's a strong effort to promote and validate St. Lucian French Creole.
Yes.
If you go to the conferences, people are doing their dissertations on that. They're trying to promote it in the school. Is there anything similar being done with non-standard, we'll say in quotes, St. Lucian English dialects, away from the standard St. Lucian dialect?
I think what has happened, and I'm trying to find the name, is it, who asked the question, please?
James Murray.
Oh, nice. Thank you so much, James, for asking. And yes, St. Lucia French Creole is a deep part of my heritage. Can you understand?
M'pa comprendre tout ça. M'pa comprendre petit. Moi a étudié créole haïtien seulement.
Oh, haïtien. So c'est haïtien? Vous êtes haïtien?
Madame moi c'est haïtien lié.
You are doing very well. Your wife is Haitian, and so you're really, really doing very well. I love it. This is my first this is my first moment to talk professionally with my Creole in a setting like this. So it's like, hands down, this is amazing. Anyways, so your question, back to your question, I think that what has happened is Hazel Simmons McDonald was one of our key scholars who had worked on the St. Lucian English vernacular and trying to get a lot of that into our curriculum and into the schools. There's sort of been less of, I would say that there's sort of been less of that formal effort to integrate it into curriculum, as in ELA curriculum in the classroom in St. Lucia. We still have a lot of resistance, as you can imagine, based on parents wanting their kids to do well and to, aspire to better English use. And so there's that tension between wanting the Creole and the vernacular to be present as part of our heritage. But then in terms of, yes, we have books now on Creole, but do they necessarily translate into us teaching ELA with Creole in St. Lucia. I still don't think we're there yet. So I hope that answers your question, James.
Oui, merci en pile.
I'm happy to hear that you're familiar with the St. Lucian context. Dr. Brian, how are we doing on time?
Yes, we actually have to wrap up
Okay.
at this point,
I
but
feel
please,
terrible. I really want to read all this chat stuff. So,
but the chat will be there. Continue to engage. Please continue to engage, Dr.
I
Smith.
will. Thank you. And thank you everyone for the lovely comments in the chat. I'll go through them and I'll try to get a response to individuals as we go through the rest of the day. Thanks again, Dr. Brian and everyone.
No problem. And if you would post your email address, contact information in case people want to.
Certainly, I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is absolutely amazing.